Welcome to Your Leadership Matters by Odgers Berndtson, a series diving into pivotal career moments and high-stakes decisions. Each episode, one of Canada's top business leaders will share personal reflections about critical moments in their career.
Hello, I'm Eloise Moodie. I'm a partner in the leadership advisory practice at Odgers Berndtson, and I'm really delighted to have Gillian Stein join us today. Gillian's the former CEO of Henry's, Canada's leading specialty digital imaging retailer. Since the early 1900s, when Gillian's great-grandfather founded the company, they've always strived to be at the forefront of retail, including, and I was really interested to learn this one, including being one of the first Canadian retailers to have an online e-commerce store in 1997, which was the dawn of the internet. So that is pretty impressive. In 2021, Gillian became the first Canadian CEO to publicly announce that they are living with a mental illness, sharing that she had bipolar disorder. Mental illness had been openly discussed in Gillian's household growing up, but it had become apparent to her how damaging the public stigma and lack of discourse was to those struggling with mental illness. She understood that if she wanted to make a real difference, it was vital for her to be open about her own challenges and prove you can still be successful with a mental illness. With this brave statement, Gillian helped reduce the shame associated with mental illness, knowing it could have the potential of putting herself and her company at risk of losing business or stakeholder confidence. Ultimately, it was an effective decision that built trust in her ability to lead authentically and with strong emotional intelligence, both of which we know are really critical leadership capabilities today. Certainly, I see that a lot in my own work. So, Gillian, welcome to Your Leadership Matters podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'll just jump right in if that's okay. You've been open about growing up with family members who have bipolar disorder and allowing your home to be a safe place for talking about your own mental health challenges. So what motivated you to go public with your story in 2021?
So I was at a funeral a number of years ago. Somebody I know had died by suicide. And yet, even in this day and age, when we talk about mental health ad nauseum, it feels like, the family did not mention why their mother, their wife, their daughter had died. The children were in their late teens, their early 20s, just about to launch, and then this. And I was floored that nobody mentioned it. And then it dawned on me, who have I told? Nobody really. My immediate family, my husband when we became serious, the occasional friend, but I certainly wasn't public about it. My family had had a history of bipolar disorder, and they were equally quiet. Very, very strong supporters of mental health, but not open. And so it became very clear to me in that moment that until I spoke up, that I couldn't expect the stigma to change. Because when we don't talk about it, we're perpetuating the stigma. And that unfortunately included me. And so every time I felt that if I didn't tell my story and speak about my own mental health situation, that it was an opportunity lost. And I think now we need it more than ever. Our employees need it, our community needs it, and I realized that I had a platform that I could use to help others. So my hope was to encourage others to share their stories around mental health, to seek the help that they need so that they could lead a normal and fulfilling and wonderful life, because it's something that we all deserve.
I love that. So before speaking publicly about your own mental health challenges, what was the internal growing need for you? So I know the funeral was a part of that realization, but what was the growing need that you were seeing around you? Maybe in the business community, the need to normalize and really understand neurodiversity and what it meant and what it looked like.
So I'd say I think it's amazing that depression and anxiety disorder in general have become more normalized, but I'd say that the business community is still very far behind in this regard. So as business leaders, we very, very rarely talk about our own personal struggles. And in general, there's still a great deal of stigma and shame around that, a broader spectrum of mental health issues, as you mentioned. So, I mean, think about it. Statistically, it's impossible that I'm the only CEO with a mental health diagnosis. And yet it was an incredibly big deal for me to speak about it publicly. And so we know the stats. In any given year, 1 in 5 Canadians experiences a mental illness. Now, that's not the same 1 in 5 every year. It changes, which means that by the time Canadians are 40 years old, 1 in 2 will either have or have had a mental illness. So we know it's an issue. And we also know that the stigma is real. So there was actually a really interesting study. It's a little bit dated, 2019, but I think it's still relevant. And it was a survey that was done of working Canadians. 75% of the respondents said that they would be reluctant or just flat out refuse to disclose a mental illness to either a coworker or to their employer. They were 3 times less likely to disclose a mental illness than a physical one. The top reasons, of course, the stigma, right? People are afraid that they're going to be treated differently, that they're going to be judged, there's going to be some kind of negative consequence, possibly losing their job. Yet 76% of those respondents stated that they themselves would be completely comfortable and supportive of a colleague with mental illness. So there's a huge, huge gap. And then you take that and you go, but there's also a business case. So we know that poor mental health has a massive, tremendous costs to employers. On average, mental health issues account for 30 to 40% of short-term disability claims and 30% of long-term disability claims. So employee productivity and lower absenteeism is closely tied to employee well-being. So there's a big need.
Business case, a business case
Yes.
as well. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So thinking about, so since 2021, how have you worked with leaders in your organization to be more vulnerable and demonstrate awareness of mental health challenges so that employees might feel more comfortable coming forward?
So the first thing was setting the stage for vulnerability and by modeling that behavior. It's not something that you can tell other people that they need to be. You have to demonstrate it. They need to feel safe and see it modeled. And then people will find their own ways to exude that quality. There's some other things that we did, some more practical things that we did company-wide. So mental health training for leaders. Your leaders need to be able to learn how to identify mental health issues and know how to start the conversation. They're not social workers, they're not therapists, they're not going to have the full conversation, but they need to be able to start it. And they actually say that training your leaders in mental health is the number one, the best investment you can make in this space. But we also provided basic mental health literacy for all of our employees, because having the right language helps raise awareness and gives people the tools to start that conversation. So everybody needs to have a good common baseline.
Did you have employees come to you and say thank you?
I have had people from everywhere, from all walks of life, come to me and say thank you. They've shared their stories, told me how they've been able to speak more openly, and that it really set the stage for them being able to get the support that they needed, which, of course, was exactly the intention.
So according to the Centre of Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, you were the first Canadian CEO, and I know statistics would say, there's others out there. Was there anyone in your circle who disagreed with the decision to come forward?
There were some close peers, other leaders who weren't sure whether this was a good idea or not, and it definitely gave me pause. To be honest, it took me 3 years from the day I decided I wanted to share my story to actually doing it. I needed to be in a place where I personally felt that I had the capacity to do it. But ultimately, my team, my family, the PR professionals that I was speaking with all felt that this was the right thing to do. Sort of collectively, we knew that the fear of the stigma was real, but that I'd had enough success, Henry's had enough credibility that we could withstand any negative responses, and more likely it was going to be positive. I think also it demonstrated a level of vulnerability and authenticity that I believed that people were really craving. And that's kind of always been a signature of my style. So in some ways it was very natural for me to do it, but it was hard.
Yeah.
It was hard.
And so did you have any negative reactions at all to the announcement? So anybody living in the community with mental illness that felt, we shouldn't need to say anything, we can just be ourselves?
Yeah, that was one of my fears. That was absolutely one of my fears, but I haven't had a single negative response yet, and the mental health community applauded the publicity. They were really happy with that.
It's wonderful. So there's a notion, and I'm sure many CEOs experience this. I know people might look to you as being different or elevated another level, and you may say, well, I'm just like everybody else. I'm a human like everybody else. Yes, I have led some complex business challenges, but the reality is that you have the same human struggles as anyone. So it really took a lot of courage to share your story. And I'm curious, what would you say to someone else who's in your position and wondering how to share theirs?
I mean, I think everybody has to think about their own situation, right? And you need to be able to think about the support groups that you have around you, the network. That's a really important thing. So I would never just say everybody should go share. I think you have to do it. I think the context is really, really important, and that you have to feel confident and comfortable and share what you can, and recognize that, again, in general, you're going to tend to get a positive response. But it really does make you, as a leader, I would say, it makes you human. And it makes you, I speak a lot about vulnerable leadership, and I think it really does set this incredible tone with the people that you surround yourself by, that pays back in, huge dividends.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I was thinking about the benefits that you personally experienced. Did you feel just more free? Was there anything tangible for you personally after you came out and talked more about your mental health challenges?
I would say the deep connections that I was able to build with people was a huge thing. For me, it's always really important to be able to connect authentically with, in particular, with employees, and finding ways to get to know people on a personal level means you have to share something personal about yourself. And so I was able to, again, deepen those relationships, deepen that trust, deepen that credibility. And as a leader, ultimately, you get better feedback. People are more loyal. They're more committed to the organization. And so while that's not why I did it, that's absolutely a positive outcome that came from it.
So would you say, 3 years later, would you say that there was a tangible shift in the culture at Henry's that highlighted the acceptance of people coming to work as their whole selves and without stigma?
I'd say that I think Henry's has always had a very open and accepting culture, and perhaps that's why I felt comfortable doing what I did. I think it's always been a very progressive company in terms of DEI, and I wonder if maybe that also is a little bit has to do with the creative nature of employees, where people generally don't fit into a corporate box. That said, obviously speaking publicly definitely enhanced that feeling of psychological safety in the organization. So if there was anybody that wasn't sure whether this was a safe space, I think that made it pretty clear.
In June of 2023, Henry's was acquired by Lynx Equity to future-proof the company. How did the values and culture of Henry's affect how you approach that acquisition or any other business decisions that you've made?
So when we were looking to sell the business, it was really important that we found an organization that understood and appreciated the values and the culture of the business. And so that's why we actually chose to go with Lynx ultimately in the end. So Lynx takes a buy and a hold strategy, which was key. And they typically don't get involved in the day-to-day operations because they respect and understand the importance of maintaining the culture that led to the business success in the first place. And so that was really important when we made that decision.
And so was that a key part of the change management strategy and communicating internally to employees? And you were able to gain comfort from people in doing that? Okay, that's fantastic. And so you remained the CEO throughout the acquisition, adapting from leading a fourth-generation family-owned company. Did this organizational change affect how you led, and in what ways? Or was it business as usual because of how you selected links in the first place?
Well, look, I mean, any change, any transition in ownership, essentially who you work for, is going to be challenging and is going to be different. But it was really important for me to stay true to who I am. What I did do, not that I didn't do it before, but really leaned into was communications. And that was in both directions. So for employees, it was really important that they felt secure and knew that nothing was going to change. So I visited every location following the acquisition, met with employees. And it wasn't just about doing it in a town hall format. It was, I would go before the store opened so that there was no customers that would distract us. Not that customers are a bad thing, but would go before before the customers were in the store, would bring coffee and donuts, and we would just have real conversations and answered questions and addressed fears. And it was important that they saw how I showed up and that I was confident. But I also had to learn how to communicate upwards, as you mentioned, right? For generations. I had spent the last 8 years reporting to a family board where I had built credibility. And obviously with your own family, there's a certain level of understanding. And so, with new ownership, I needed to start from the beginning and I needed to learn what it was that the parent company now needed to know about and what they wanted to hear about. So communication, I think, was the biggest piece that wasn't necessarily so much that it changed, but that I really needed to lean into.
You've been in a leadership position for over 15 years. How have you seen your leadership change and evolve over the years in terms of what's been really important to you as a leader?
So I would say in the context of work, vulnerability has had historically a really bad reputation. Definitely when I first started being a young female, something that I was very, very cautious about. But I think in recent years, vulnerability has not just grown to become culturally acceptable, but I think in many cases it's really welcomed and encouraged. And I think it leads to transparency and respect in the workplace, higher engagement, better productivity. I think there's so much to be said for getting to know your employees in a way. It's not just about being polite but really getting to know them, acknowledging when you're wrong, sharing new and different ideas, right? But acknowledging that maybe you're not sure if this idea is going to work, but you're going to try it. And maybe you're going to learn something new alongside your team. And that gives your team permission to try new things. And that's how we innovate. And I'd also say, we often shy away from controversial topics because we're not sure how to approach them. But if you, come from a place of curiosity and openness, then I think everybody wins. And I think these are things that are really changing when it comes to leadership that really go a long way.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that because certainly, and when I think back to, if I was to put a date on it, it probably would be around 2021. So after the first hardest part of COVID maybe, where we started to see a shift in what organizations were valuing for leadership capabilities. And I would say now something I've just been really interested to see is we will have boards come to us and say, how do we hire our next CEO to have humility? How do we test for humility?
Yeah.
So humility, authenticity, those are attributes we hear about a lot. And of course, people want to figure out how to identify those things. But yeah, so it's, it's easier sometimes than others, but
yes,
but it really connects with what you're saying.
Yeah.
When you think about the future generations of people at work, what's your hope when it comes to how they might experience the workplace and how they may lead and how organizations will evolve?
Well, I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but I'm just gonna talk
reinforcement.
This trend of vulnerable leadership. Again, just the transparency and authenticity. Employee engagement, that higher levels of employee engagement. Just everybody's happier as a result.
When I think about Brené Brown's early work and her first TED Talk, and it was kind of divisive. Right. So a lot of people did not want to talk about the concept of shame, did not want to talk about the concept of vulnerability when it came to a corporate environment. And now this is just the vernacular. Right. So it's just interesting.
Yeah, we still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
And I think it depends on the organization, but if you can embrace it, then it's great.
As one of my final questions, I wanted to ask, what's the best piece of advice you've received, and who did it come from?
So I had a coach when I first started as CEO, and one of the first things he told me was that being a CEO was a marathon and not a sprint. And that gave me permission to take care of myself. And I can tell you that I would have burned out years ago if I hadn't learned how to prioritize myself. And I'd say this is true on the family front as well, that these are words that I live by, and internally grateful for that advice that I got early on.
Has it been advice that you share with others ongoing?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I feel like writing it down. But I don't have a mechanism to do that with right now. That's wonderful.
I'll text it to you.
Yeah. So curious, had you had a coach before you became CEO?
No. It was actually one of my conditions when I first became CEO was that I wanted to have a coach. That was important to me.
Do you continue to have a coach ongoing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I always have to have somebody that I can speak to. I think it can be very lonely being a CEO, and I think it's always important to have somebody that you can talk to.
So how do you think having this role and being a CEO at Henry's, how has it shaped you as a leader and as a person?
How has it shaped me? Well, it's tested my resilience and made me realize just how resilient I am, especially considering all of the challenges that we've had, particularly over the last few years, things that I would have never had expected. And that resilience is something that I'm very proud of. And I think, again, is something that will help me in future roles, personal life as well. Absolutely has challenged and tested my resilience.
It was really interesting when I started researching you and a little bit more about Henry's, sort of in terms of the transformation that you led the organization through. Unquestionably would have been, I would think, well, I guess I don't know, 4 generations is a long time. There could have been other very difficult times in 4 generations since 1909. But really, you led the company through a massive transformation. Do you want to share a little bit more about that process and the creativity involved?
Sure. Yeah. So, in 4 generations, there have been other challenging times. But when I took over, it was 2015, and the industry was completely being disrupted by both in the retail side and then obviously through the cell phone. And so for us, it was about finding ways to reimagine the business, reimagine the structure of the business, who our customers were, what retail meant to them, who were we competing with, and trying to see the future in terms of, okay, well, also, what does this mean for the category and what's coming down the pipeline? And so there was a lot of work in terms of strategy. There was a lot of work in terms of reinforcing what was core to the business, what made the business strong and unique to begin with. It was all levels of the organization that we had to touch. New strategy, new execution, new team members who could embrace and drive that change, new values that we had to really push and teach throughout the organization. It was a major transformation.
Well, good for you. When I was reading about it, I thought, well, that is very, very creative. And so a great example of how when we have these challenges, sometimes out of that challenge can come something really special that wouldn't have happened. Well, Gillian, thank you so much for taking the time to be on this podcast. You've shared really valuable perspectives and helped to reinforce the benefits and real opportunities that emerge when people are authentic and can create a workplace where people can be themselves.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been great. Thank you.
Your Leadership Matters is brought to you by Odgers Berndtson Canada, a premier integrated leadership advisory firm working to place and develop great leaders. You can find this and other episodes on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts.